Come back in one piece. Most of us have probably heard that before and never thought much about it. It sounds normal, almost like nothing. But the more I thought about it, the stranger it got. Because what does it actually mean to come back whole? Not just alive, not just in one body, whole. And I think that question may be hiding all over the One Piece. Because this story keeps showing people who come back, but not whole. Or people who lose almost everything, except the one part of themselves the world never fully takes. And I think that's where this gets much deeper. Because the world does not need to kill you to take something from you. A lot of the time, it doesn't even need to leave a visible mark. You can come back from a fight, you can come back from a heartbreak, you can come back from betrayal, you can come back with no broken bones, no blood, no proof on the outside, and still not come back whole. That's the strange part. Because when people say come back in one piece, we usually hear it as just survive, just make it back. But surviving and returning whole are not the same thing. Sometimes what the world takes first is not your body, it's your clarity, your peace, your trust, your sense of who you are, your ability to sleep, your ability to laugh, your ability to move forward without carrying that weight inside you. And that's why I think this question matters so much in One Piece. Because this story keeps showing people who makes it back physically, but not as the same person. Or people who lose almost everything except that one part of themselves the world never fully takes. And once you start looking at it like that, the whole story changes. Because then the real question is not did they survive? It becomes what did the world take from them and what still remained? And if that's the question, then the next one is obvious. If you are supposed to come back whole, then come back where? What is home really? Because I don't think home is just a building. I don't think home is just the place you sleep. Home is the place where you can return and still be yourself. That's what makes it home. Not the walls, not the location, not the roof. The feeling that whatever happened out there, whatever the world did to you, you can still come back here and not have to lie about who you are. That's home. And the more I thought about that, the more One Piece started looking different to me. Because so many people in this story lose that. They lose the place where they can return as themselves. And that's when the damage really starts. Because once you lose home, the world doesn't just wound you, it starts defining you. And I think that's why this matters so much for Luffy too. Because Luffy doesn't just want freedom in some empty, lonely sense. He doesn't just want movement for the sake of movement. He is always building something around himself. A table, a ship, a crew, a place where people can laugh, eat, rest, be loud, be weird, be broken, and still being, and still belong. So maybe what Luffy is really building is not just a crew. Maybe he's building home, a moving home, a place where people who were fractured by the world can still come back to themselves. And that changes the way the Straw Hats feel too, because suddenly they stop looking like just useful companions and start looking like the pieces of a house, the conditions that make return possible. And once you think of home that way, another thing becomes clear. The system can never be home. Because maybe the system is not just something outside us. Maybe it begins much earlier than that. Maybe a system begins the moment a whole stops accepting its own parts. That is why York matters so much. Because before the split, Vegapunk was still one person. Complicated, yes. Contradictory, yes, but still one. Then the whole was divided. And the division itself was not the problem. The real problem appeared when one fragment stopped seeing itself as part of a whole and started wanting to become the whole by taking the rest. That is York. Not just greed in the simple sense, something more dangerous than that. Because greed is what a fragment becomes when it no longer remembers what it means to be whole. It does not want coexistence, it wants completion through possession. Seems familiar, don't you think? It does not want to live with the other parts. It wants to absorb them, replace them, stand where the whole once stood and call that victory. And that is where the system begins. Not just in law, not just in government, not just in hierarchy, but in the decision that one shape, one role, one order, one function must dominate all the others. That is why a system can be built long before you ever arrive in it. Because it does not begin with you. It begins with a structure already decided in advance. A place that already knows what belongs, what fits, what is useful, what is allowed to remain. And that is exactly why some people will never truly belong to it. Not because they failed, but because the system was never built with room for their full self in the first place. And that is why Water 7 matters so much too. Because Usopp did not just break with Luffy emotionally. He let one wounded fragment of himself rise above the whole. His pain was real. But in Water 7, pain stopped being speaking as a part of a whole. It tried to become the whole. And the moment a fragment tries to rule the whole, the structure starts breaking. And maybe that is why Usopp is so dangerous as a character. Not just because he's afraid, but because for a long time he needed the world to name him, before he could believe he was real. That is what makes him structurally so interesting, because a fragment that cannot believe in itself will always be tempted to seek completion from the outside. That is the difference between a system and a home. A system asks if you fit. Home asks if you can return as yourself. A system can name you, rank you, use you, preserve your form, but that still does not mean it knows you. And it definitely does not mean it can receive you. Because home is not something already finished before you enter it. Home is something you recognize, something you feel, something that allows yourself to exist without asking permission. And that is why the system can preserve form and still fail to preserve the self. Because preserving form is not the same thing as preserving wholeness. In fact, that may be what false wholeness really is. When one part takes control, freezes the rest, and calls that order. And once you see that, the system in One Piece starts looking much darker. Because it is not just trying to control people, it is trying to decide which version of a person gets to remain. And if that is true, then the question becomes unavoidable. If the system cannot hold the whole self, then what can? And that is where D starts becoming really interesting. Because maybe D was never meant to explain the whole person. Maybe that was the mistake from the start. Maybe D is not the total self. Maybe it is the one part the world never fully gets to own. That would explain a lot. Because One Piece keeps returning to the same strange idea. Something can end and still continue. A person dies, but the song remains. A promise is broken by death, but not really, it changes carriers. A sword stays, a hat stays, name, laugh, story stays. And once that starts clicking, leaving something behind, stops sounding sentimental. It stops sounding like memory for memory's sake. It starts sounding like survival. Not of the body, not of the whole outer form, but of that one part of you that must not disappear. And that's why this changes D for me. Because if D is just a letter, it's small. If it's just a name, it's still small. But if D is that irreducible fragment of the self that refuses total capture, then suddenly it matters. Then D becomes the part of the world cannot fully absorb, cannot fully define, cannot fully preserve on its own terms. And that also changes what it means to leave something behind. Because maybe leaving something behind is not just being remembered. Maybe it is making sure not all of you disappears when the world takes the rest. That's why signatures matter. That's why songs matter. That's why promises matter. That's why the hat matters. That's why the sword matters. These are not just symbols, they are carriers. Places where something of the self remains outside total distraction. And if that's true, then the Straw Hats are not just people traveling together. They are carrying pieces of return. And this is the part where the whole crew started looking completely different to me. Because what if the Straw Hats are not just a group? What if they are a restoration system? What if each one of them returns something the world keeps breaking? And suddenly the crew stops being a list of roles and starts looking like the conditions needed for a person to come back whole. Luffy restores movement, laughter, the impulse to live forward. He doesn't hand people a perfect answer. He brings back the part of them that still wants to move. Zoro restores line, code, the part of a person that says, "This is where I stand." Nami restores direction, because sometimes you don't come back to yourself by being stronger. Sometimes you come back by finding direction again. Usopp restores the self that fear keeps abandoning. Sanji restores warmth, care, the feeling that life is still worth feeding. Choppa restores recovery, not just healing in a technical sense. He protects the conditions that let a person become themselves again. Robin restores what the world tried to erase: truth, memory, knowledge. Frankie restores function, the ability to move, build, act, keep going. Brook restores continuity, the part of life that survives death through memory and song. Jinbe restores dignity, balance, the kind of inner weight that keeps chaos from swallowing everything. And when you put all of that together, the Straw Hats stop looking like a team built only for war. They start looking like a structure built to return the world to itself. And that's why I think Luffy doesn't just gather fighters, he gathers restorers. People who each know how to bring back some part of what the world keeps taking away. And if that's true, then the most painful example of this might actually be Usopp. Because Usopp is the one who still hasn't fully returned. Usopp is strange, because compared to the rest of the crew, his backstory almost looks lighter. And yet he feels like the furthest behind. Why? I don't think it's because he has less potential. I think it's because the thing holding him back goes deeper than the pain from the outside. Most Straw Hats were broken by something huge in the world around them. Usopp is different. Usopp's biggest problem is what happens after the wound goes inward: self-doubt. self-betrayal, the endless ability to explain away his own possibility. That's why he's such a dangerous character, because the others were often forced to grow by what the world did to them. Usopp keeps surviving by staying split, by being many things at once: a liar, a coward, a dreamer, a brave man for 1 second, then someone else again. And that means even when he's strong, even when he does something real, it never fully settles into identity. It doesn't become "this is who I am now." It becomes "that happened once." And that's a huge difference, because in One Piece, real strength is not just power, it's will. And Usopp's problem is not that he has no strength, it's that he has never fully allowed his will to return to one whole self. That's why Wata 7 hurts him so deeply, because Mary was not just a ship for him, Mary was continuity, safety, something close to home. Losing Mary felt like losing a carrier of self, and maybe that's why Elbaf matters so much. Because if Elbaf is the one dream Usopp truly set in front of himself, then this may be the first time he has nowhere left to hide from who he is. No more fragments, no more scattered selves, no more half-belief. If Usopp really returns there, it won't be a normal power-up. It will be unification. The return of someone who spent too long not being one. And that may matter more than people think, because if the final war is really about return, then the man who struggled the longest to return to himself may become one of the most important people in it. And that brings us to Imu, because if the Straw Hats restore, then Imu does the opposite. I don't think Imu is just a ruler. I think Imu may represent something much worse: the refusal to let life be alive. Because life naturally means change, departure, risk, loss, aging, death, passing things on. And I'm not sure Imu can accept that. That's why I don't think the final enemy in One Piece is death. It may be the refusal of death. The refusal to let things end naturally. The refusal to let the world leave home. The refusal to let anything go so it can become something new. That's what makes Imu terrifying. Not just control, preservation. A system that would rather keep the form forever than trust what survives beyond the form. And that's where false wholeness really appears. Because the system offers continuity but not living it. Preserved continuity, stillness, maintenance, form without truth, existence without real becoming. That is not wholeness, that is fear dressed up as order. And symbolically, this is where Imu starts looking almost like a false force of protection. The kind of protection that does not keep you safe so you can grow. It keeps you safe so you never leave. And that changes everything, because then D becomes the opposite. D stops looking like a mystery of bloodline and starts looking like the people who accept the form can end without the self being exhausted by form. That's why they smile at death, not because death is nothing, but because they do not believe the whole self ends there. And that's why I think the final war may not be about who can destroy more. It may be about who can restore what the world has distorted, divided, frozen, or claimed. Not just bodies, selves. not just land, inner territory, not just history, the conditions under which life can still return to itself. And if that's true, then Luffy's crew is not here just to help him win. They are here to return the world to the possibility of being whole again, to being one piece. So maybe that's what this was about all along. Not just treasure, not just power, not just survival, but return. Not whether you make it back, but whether you make it back whole. Maybe even that is too simple, because coming back whole does not necessarily mean coming back with everything. Maybe it means returning with the one part of you that is the most important, the one part that the world cannot take from you, the one part that still lets you be you. And maybe that is why leaving something behind matters so much in One Piece. Because to leave something behind is not just to be remembered. It is to make sure not all of you disappears. And maybe that was the question, hidden inside that simple sentence all along. Come back in one piece. Not just alive, not just home, whole. Thank you guys for watching, I hope you enjoyed this video. Please let me know in the comments what do you think about the editing, because I think that's the thing that I struggle the most. See you!